The Honorable Janet G. Bostwick. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Christine. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, particularly the children of some of our leading suffragettes who are with us here today. I'm pleased to be able to speak with you this morning. Forgive me for having to have assistance and stumbling up here, but this weekend I've been trying to belie my 72 years, and I did something I've never done in my life. I modeled. And now my legs are speaking to me. In the general elections in the colony of the Bahama Islands in 1949, Mr. Rufus Ingram, the Member of Parliament for Inagua for 2 years, lost his bid to be re-elected. His wife, Mrs. Mary Ingram, thought that his chances of winning would have been greatly enhanced if women of property were permitted to vote on the same terms as men were. She, together with Mrs. Mabel Walker, the wife of Dr. C.R. Walker, a member of Parliament for the Southern District in New Providence, actively began to agitate for women to have the right to vote on the same terms as men. Mrs. Ingram was a businesswoman. She was a mother. She owned properties, and she was a storekeeper. That's right, Alice. Mrs. Walker, an American, a university graduate, was a school teacher. They were good friends. Both were members of the Elks Lodge, and both lived on Hospital Lane in New Providence. Mrs. Walker was chair of the Civil Liberties Committee of the Kirkview Elks Lodge. Mrs. Ingram was a past daughter ruler, and she was also a leader in the Star of the East Lodge of Samaritans. They used their contacts and influence in the lodges to further their cause, and according to Mrs. Ingram's account, as written in a letter to the press on the 27th of November, 75, she was able to get the signatures of more than 500 persons with the assistance of Reverend Dr. H.W. Brown, renowned senior pastor of Bethel Baptist Church, Mr. Wilfred Toot, Mrs. Gladys Bailey, and she, Mrs. Ingram, and her 5 children, including Alice. That first petition was presented to Parliament and tabled by Dr. C.R. Walker in 1952, the very same year that the United Nations Convention on Political Rights of Women was adopted by that august body. When suffrage talks began in this little colony of the Bahama Islands, women's suffrage, had not yet been accepted as a desirable goal for nations of the world. Our women were therefore in the vanguard of progressive thinking, and this notwithstanding the fact that most of them had not been afforded high school level education. Of even more significance is the fact that the first petition seeking women's suffrage was presented to Parliament before any political parties existed in the Bahamas. Mrs. Ingram stated that the suffrage movement was formed between 1951 and 52, and she was elected president. What is definite is that in 1958, when the petition for suffrage was again presented to the House of Assembly, this time by Sir Gerald Cash, Mrs. Ingram states that she was a UBP. But she had approached Sir Gerald, who was an independent member of the Parliament, to present the petition. From the early beginning of the movement, matriarchs of the PLP, such as Mrs. J.K. Simonet and Eugenia Lockett, were active members. They and later others of the PLP worked arduously to secure the vote for women because they felt that their party would not be successful in winning the government unless women gained that right. When Dr. Doris Johnson returned to the Bahamas from university in 1958, she became involved with the movement. In September of that year, she and others established the National Women's Council, an umbrella organization of many of women's NGOs. That council, with Irma Grant Smith as its president, and Lady Russell, wife of Sir Dudley Russell, as its vice president, adopted the suffrage cause. Irma Grant Smith was not known to have any party affiliation, and Lady Russell was a Caucasian and a member of the leading class in Bahamian society. I recall that her husband, Sir Dudley, was then chairman of the Public Service Commission, and I remember that because in that same year, in 1957, he interviewed me for my first job at the Attorney General's office. It was thought that Lady Russell was a strong supporter of the UBP. In late 1958 and thereafter, the PLP officially championed the suffrage cause. And it is well known, of course, that Dame Doris Johnson presented the women's suffrage case to the Parliament in her historic and dynamic address to that body of 19th January 1959. I have given these brief facts to show that the suffrage movement reached across partisan lines, racial and social class divides. The movement was actually started by a Black woman who, after party politics was introduced in the Bahamas, was a member of the UBP. It was embraced by the PLP. It was adopted by women without party affiliation, supported by women of different races and social standing, and it was championed by progressive men. Sir Stafford Sands was not one of them. He had said that women would get the right to vote over his dead body, and he wielded great influence over the decisions of the UBP. Yet, at the end of 1960, the UBP, in a party meeting, voted 63-2 in favor of extending the right to vote to women. And the party, and Sir Stafford was still alive. Mary Ingram was an extraordinary woman. She had taken a stand which was diametrically opposed to the position of the political group which she supported. And it appears that there were other women of her party which had done so. Of course, the ladies of the PLP had the full support and encouragement of their male counterparts in their party. The militancy and persistency of the women paid off. They had been throughout the islands of the Bahamas. They had petitioned for the colonial office. They had taken their case to the United Nations. They had obtained the assistance of international organizations. They had been relentless, and they succeeded. Such was the fight and the drive and the militancy and the constancy and commitment and dedication of our pioneer women, and how proud they did us. I can remember it very well. I remember the day when Dame Doris addressed the court, and I was working in that court building upstairs, and I was down there and I heard that address. It was exciting. In Dame Doris's address to Parliament, she addressed the main concern of the suffragists, which was the right to vote, but she also raised their concerns about the fact that there were all male juries. the fact that they still sent delinquent girls of 8 to 11 years to jail, that there was local government in the outer islands, but there was never the appointment of women to the local boards and committees. There were no female justices of the peace, and there were no out-island commissioners. Women were granted the right to vote by legislation passed on the 9th of February, 1961, but the battle was not over. Thereafter, women had to be persuaded and encouraged to register to vote, and then they had to be taught how to vote. Again, the matriarchs of the PLP did a most commendable job in this respect. And what was remarkable is the women who did this work were housewives in the main, shopkeepers, some teachers, very few teachers, because, teachers at that time were part of the public service, and public officers could not be involved in political activities. There were clerks, there were etc. They were not professional women, but women who were committed to ensuring victory at the polls for their party, and thereby securing a better opportunity for the advancement of their children politically, socially, and economically. Women suffragists showed us that in order to bring about significant change, we women must accept sometimes that the cause is bigger than the individual, bigger than the party, bigger than any of the things which divide and separate us, and that much can be accomplished when we unite. Unfortunately, after the vote was won, in the main, suffragettes rested on their laurels and were content to stand behind their male leaders. Many of the leading women of the Bahamas felt that politics was a man's job and women should be content to raise their families and, where possible, contribute to the income of that family. In an interview with the press in November of 1981, a similar view was expressed by Lady Caroline Butler, wife of our first Bahamian Governor General, when she stated that she did not believe that women should become actively and directly involved in politics. She felt that, and I quote, "Politics takes a devil of a lot out of a person." She was right, And she said, as a result of a woman's family would be shortchanged by her involvement in politics. Some of that is true, too. She conceded that perhaps a woman with no family could be active in politics if she was educated and willing to carry, and I quote, "a heavy burden." This thinking was undoubtedly the informal position of the hierarchy of the PLP, because otherwise its failure to have a woman elected to Parliament until some 25 years after women gained the right to vote is unexplainable. It is unfathomable why Dame Doris Johnson, for example, was never nominated as a candidate in a seat which the PLP had a good chance of winning. It is of significance that the first PLP female member of Parliament was Mrs. Ruby Ann Cooper Darling, the first woman to register to vote in 1962. So our forerunners rested on their laurels. But the spirit of social activism was ignited in a cadre of younger women who at relatively young ages banded together to agitate for changes affecting the national and personal lives of women. I speak of women particularly who were members of the BPWA, Bahamas Professional Women's Association, and who, under the leadership of the then relatively young Pauline Allen, I think Pauline was about 24, 25, fought for the right for women to sit on juries, which was an issue presented by suffragettes in 1959, but which did not become a reality until years later. Many of those women agitated, the women of the BPWA and others, agitated for consumer protection measures and gained the cessation of the practice of pricing over items imported and displayed in stores after new shipments were brought in at a higher price. They also taught women shoppers to be aware of expiry dates. I speak of women who banded together as WAR, Women Against Rape, and took part in the largest demonstration denouncing rape and brought about changes so that rapes were no longer published sensationally on the front pages of newspapers. And the identity of the victim and her family was concealed, and brought about changes where victims were taken into private screened areas away from the general outpatient section of the hospital for medical examinations. And wherever possible, a female officer would take statements from the victim. It was a time when social awareness and conscience were awakened on gender issues, and when voices spoke out. They were being true to the legacy which we had received from strong, principled, and fearless women suffragettes. There have been many changes. There have been a very large number of there are now a very large number of female justices of the peace. We have family island administrators, members of local boards, district councils, national boards, commissions. Women are members of the medical, legal, and judicial professions. They are members of parliament. They have held the highest office in the nation. But there is still so much more to do. As women, we have become complacent, materialistic, and quiet. We have never been more educated, nor have we ever enjoyed greater levels of influence. Yet, this is hardly reflected in our involvement in seeking social justice and true equality. In 1949, we were in the forefront of progressive thinking, agitating for empowerment of women before UN adopted that position. Now, we are lagging behind. Some 20 years or so ago, the world body set a desired quota of 30% for representation of women in parliament. To achieve this, some countries have promulgated legislation making that 30% mandatory. It is a goal for which we should be working, and it has been advised that where laws do not mandate that minimum percentage, political parties should seek to offer 30% female candidates. The FNM is now actively seeking to address that, and this year they're offering 25%. And the leadership has made it known that moving forward, the FNM is looking to the time, and I think they've said 10 years, when an equal number of FNM women and men will be offered to the electorate as candidates. I don't know if any other party has taken a formal position. Last year, I said to a meeting of lawyers in Freeport, women lawyers in Freeport, and I quote, on 6 October 1992, 6 October 1992, almost 20 years ago, the Bahamas ratified the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. We did so with certain reservations. The Bahamas did not adopt Article 2A, which obligated it to embody the principle of the equality of men and women in our Constitution. and Article 9, which obligated to grant women equal rights with men to acquire, change, or retain their nationality, and Article 16H, which conferred the same rights for both spouses in respect of ownership, etc., of property. We are now in a position to remove our reservation regarding property ownership since the passing of the Inheritance Act. We must yet, 38 years after independence, retain our reservations in the other two instances because women of the Bahamas are still discriminated against in the supreme law of the land, our Constitution. For this, we cannot blame the government. We must blame ourselves. How does it make you feel? If you feel as I do, belittled, abused, insulted, you may think it time to remember the legacy of the women's movement and use your power to bring about change. Discrimination against women, as stated in the preamble of the CEDAW, is still an obstacle to the participation of women on equal terms with men in the political, civil, economic, and cultural life of their countries. It still hampers the growth of the prosperity of the society and the family, and still makes more difficult the full development of the potentialities of women in the service of their countries and of humanity. And it is shameful that we in this age and at this time accept it. It is, in my view, an equal shame that we are prepared in this day and age to accept that a man can rape his wife and be immune to legal sanctions. We who cried out against rape are painfully silent now that our children are being abused and raped and murdered. We are not agitating for laws and practices to afford us time to be at schools at crucial times, like at times when we are to receive our children's reports. But we are fighting for employment contracts to give us time off on our birthdays. We are not concerned with mentoring our young girls or for you, young people, to mentor others younger than yourselves. And we leave them to emulate junglists. Our foremothers were active. They persisted long even before they were involved in the suffragette movement. They participated in the Mothers Club, where they were concerned to find food, clothing, and house furnishings for less fortunate. They established schools for toddlers. They formed the Civil Bells, where they provided wholesome extracurricular activities for young people. And they were even ahead of international bodies in seeking equal voting rights for women. They used their lodges, they used their churches, they used whatever gathering to pursue social justice and true equality and to promote higher education. The Mothers Club, long before I went to high school, had an association with Bethune-Cookman College and were granting scholarships to young Bahamian women to go away to school from that time. And they were trying to get their youth and their young people equally involved in all of the things which they were doing. Today, charitable institutions, national service agencies, and programs are all pleading for our involvement, for your involvement. And what are we doing? Really, and I speak to you ladies. Our foremothers have bequeathed us an extremely rich legacy. What legacy are we now formulating and bequeathing to those who follow us? Think about it.
As I sat here this morning, I found it very impressive and rather ironic, but at the same time rather fitting that I, not being female, not being Bahamian, and in fact, having been born 6 months after suffrage had taken place in this country, should find myself here this morning adding the voice of a neighboring nation on this momentous and worthy occasion. Funny how the world changes, and funny how the world will continue to change with the likes of yourself. I want to offer my congratulations to the organizers from the Bureau of Women's Affairs and the College of the Bahamas for coordinating this informative and timely symposium as the world marks the 101st observance of International Women's Day on March 8th. It is clear from the presentations today and by the strides made by Bahamian women from all walks of life that we are at a moment of historic opportunity. The United States Secretary of State, Hillary Rodham Clinton, has referred to this new global era as the participation age. This is a time when every individual, regardless of gender, is poised to be a contributing and valued member of society. In the Bahamas and around the world, we are witnessing examples of this participation age. And women are a cornerstone of this new global era of progress due to the simple fact that no country can hope to move ahead if it is leaving half of its people behind. Women and girls drive our economies. They build peace and prosperity. Investing in women means investing in global economic progress, political stability, and greater prosperity for everyone the world over. For the last 6 years, in honor of International Women's Day, the United States government has asked all of its embassies around the world to nominate one leader for its highest award for female leaders, the International Women of Courage Award. The United States views this award as an opportunity to not only honor the achievements of one remarkable woman, but also to renew the call for action, investment, and commitment to women's equality. As Secretary Clinton once noted, what we are learning around the world is that if women are healthy and educated, their families will flourish. If women are free from violence, their families will flourish. If women have a chance to work and earn as full and equal partners in society, their families will flourish. And when families flourish, communities and nations will flourish. With this in mind, it gives me great pleasure to recognize the United States Embassy's 2012 Women of Courage Award recipient, the Honorable Janet G. Bostwick. This award is in recognition of Mrs. Bostwick's work over the last 4 decades as an activist, politician, and diplomat, who persevered in the struggle to address inequalities faced by women throughout the Bahamas. As a member of Parliament, Mrs. Bostwick has fought for and achieved a number of milestones in support of women's rights, including the Affiliation Proceeding Act, the Inheritance Act, the Matrimonial Causes Act, and the Status of Children Act, as well as amendments to labor and national insurance legislation. The United States Embassy has selected Mrs. Bostwick for this year's award in recognition of her continued commitment to advancing the rights of women in this beautiful nation. She stands as a testament to the essential role that women can and must play in building just, equitable, and sustainable communities in the 21st century. Ladies and gentlemen, at this time I would invite you to please join me in welcoming to the podium a Bahamian national matriarch of women's rights and the United States Embassy's 2012 International Woman of Courage nominee, the Honorable Janet G. Bostwick. Congratulations. Your remarks inspired me greatly. Thank you so much. Now, if you'll permit me, undoubtedly they'll want us to take a photograph. Mrs. Bostwick, in honor of International Women's Day, please accept this well-deserved reward with our profound appreciation for your leadership in advocating women's rights and empowerment throughout the Bahamas. May your determination and call for change inspire others to make valuable contributions in their communities as we all embark on this new global era of participation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Again. Thank you so much. What a magnificent speech. May I get a copy of it at some point? I want my daughters to do that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much. I'm not very often lost for words, but I did not expect this morning at all. I want to state my appreciation, my gratitude, and I believe that the award to me, although I accept it on behalf of all the countless Bahamian women who have fought over many, many decades and who still now continue to fight, many of whom I see here. I accept it on behalf of us all. Thank you.
Ms. Chairperson, students, observers, and faculty members, I am so pleased to respond to this invitation to update and inform our young people about a historic event in our country's political history, namely the genesis of the women's suffrage movement. You heard Mrs. Bostwick, who is my very dear friend, speak at length about my mother, Mary Ingram. And so she has taken my whole speech. She has taken away everything, and I mean totally everything that I would have shared with you. And so I will just say in a nutshell about the life of Mary Ingram as a person then. My mother was a Christian lady, a charitable lady. And the time of which we are speaking would have been 1949 to 1962. It was an exciting time here in the Bahamas. Women were all involved in politics, were not so much involved in politics, but they were firmly active in lodges such as the Elks and the Curfew Temple and various social programs, most definitely churches. It was a time when children obeyed their parents under fear of being reprimanded publicly and privately. It was a time when the whole neighborhood were considered just surrogate parents with the same rights and privileges. I was only 8 years old at that time, and I could remember my mom, who was an avid gardener. She loved roses. She was a fabulous cook. Her coconut tarts, there was no second to none of it. She was also a devoted woman, and she revered her husband, who was Rufus H. Ingram. And it was on the simple comment that he made when he returned from canvassing in Ackland's Crooked Island and Inawa that had he had the right for women to vote, he was sure that he would have attained his seat. That simple, very simple statement that he made to my mom propelled her into action. And as Janet has stated, and I state again, all her friends and neighbors, and there were many, because we lived in Hospital Lane North, and the Walkers lived in Hospital Lane South, and Miss Althea Baltimore, who was the drafter of that first petition, she lived on Meeting Street. And so she gathered all of her friends, all of her influential friends, and they started the women's suffrage movement. I'm sure all of the children of those committee members who I just spoke about were challenged to solicit votes. I could remember distinctly sitting on the wall of our house in Hospital Lane and asking everyone who passed, would you sign this petition? Would you sign this petition? And did I know what I was doing? No, I didn't know. All I know is my mother told me to sit on the wall and get as many signatures as I could. And so we did. And the rest of it is history, as Janet spoke to you about. Yes, the women of that time were motivated, and they pushed, they agitated, and they did not stop. We women today, we know what's wrong, and we know there are things that we would like to see happen in our Bahamas. But you know what is said about Bahamian women? They do it for a short time, but they have no stickability. Women, you need to be agitating when you see something wrong and you want to right it. And the key to that is perseverance. Note that I said to you we were talking about the time period of 1949 to 1962. They pressed. They did everything they could to make sure that women received the right to vote. There is a song that I listen to often on the radio that says, "Who's gonna fill their shoes?" And they're talking about all of the people who have influenced us over the years. Women and gentlemen, who's gonna fill the shoes of our suffragette women? Who's gonna take the charge and the lead? We talked about the BPW and Mrs. Pauline Allen Dean. We need to have a few more Pauline Allen Deans around because there are many, many, many issues that we Bahamian women can address, but we do not persist in the cause of it. And the key to the success of any movement is its persistence. You will forgive me repeating all of the things that Janet has said about Mrs. Mary Ingram. I am in agreement with her, but as time will not allow me, I thank you for allowing me to present what I have. Thank you.
Ms. Moderator, staff and students of COB, and friends. I'm delighted to be here to speak to you about my mother and her involvement in the suffrage movement. The theme, the fight is not yet done, and that is so true. In our household, that is the home of my parents, Dr. Claudius Roland Walker and Mrs. Mabel Cordelia Walker, there was always talk about the inequalities in the social, education, political, culture, and economic systems in the Bahamas, especially for the Black people of our country. It had not been easy for the Black Bahamian. My mother, along with Miss Mary Ingram, Georgiana Simonet, Mrs. Eugenie Lockhart, and Mildred Moxing, and other women wanted the same rights as men, especially to participate in the political process. They met regularly at the Reinhardt Hotel, the hotel my father had built on Blue Hill Road and Tin Shop Corner. These women were determined to achieve their objectives. My mother was the secretary of the Elks Curfew Lodge, and the women of this organization led the way in the signing of a petition for women's right to vote. They obtained signatures from many, many women. This petition was presented to the House of Assembly in 1952 by my father, who was a member of the House of Assembly at that time. Likewise was the husband of Mary Ingram, Mr. Rufus Ingram. To my mind, I feel and have always felt that the women of the Elks Lodge do not get the credit for what they had done. I recall when a governor came to the Bahamas, and I think it was Governor Gray, to take up his post, he was greeted at Prince George Dock with women of the suffrage movement carrying the placards which demanded the women's right to vote. It is to be noted that although my mother, with other women, fought for the right to vote, she was not eligible to vote because she was an American. My mother represented the movement by attending the Women's Alliance conferences in Africa and Europe. And at these times, she was accompanied by my father. Now, I can remember that Doug Maynard, and he's going to speak to you, was always present with his mother, with Miss Simonet. And I was always under the impression that he was the unofficial member of the movement because he was always there. As I stated, they met at the Reinhardt Hotel. These small group of women, they met all the time. But my job often was to take the ladies home after the meeting. As you have been told, legislation was passed in 1961, which allowed women to vote. Now, the most disappointing election for me was in 1962, when women voted for the first time, because I felt sure at that time we would have achieved majority rule because of the women vote. But that was not to be. So, we have a lot to do. I must say that for the past 50 years, women in this country have made tremendous progress. Because when we think about 50 years prior, when women did domestic, in the public service, they could only become teachers or nurses. But now they hold many, many influential jobs. And they have become productive citizens. But as your motto states, the fight is not yet done. Thank you.
Good morning, staff and students of the College of the Bahamas, distinguished guests who took the time to come here today, particularly my sisters. My mother was Mrs. Eugenia Lockhart, as our moderator informed you. She was a champion for social justice for all persons. She joined the Progressive Liberal Party in its early days on coming to Nassau from Ragged Island. She was born in Ragged Island. Most of us, her 15 children, were born in Ragged Island. So when she came to Nassau, she brought with her 12 children who were born in Ragged Island. This in itself was no small feat. But my mother feared no challenge. My mother, on top of being a champion for social justice, believed that the majority should not be led by the minority. And that is what was happening in the Bahamas at the time. It took little appealing, therefore, from Mr. Henry M. Taylor to convince my parents to join the newly formed Progressive Liberal Party. This came before the suffrage movement. I think you heard that my mother was a PLP. Her natural instincts at the time drew her to that party because they were talking about social justice. Now, I might take a few minutes, more than 5 minutes, but I noted that Ms. Musgrove took 3 minutes. Ms. Banwell took 1 minute, 4 minutes, so I think I have 4 more minutes. You gave it up. I'm not taking them. You gave them up, so I'm using them. They had become involved with Mr. Taylor, who was the person who exuded the spirit of social justice. He was a decent and good man, and my parents became very fond of him. Mr. Taylor often visited Ragged Island because he was the MP also for Ragged Island.
He was the organizer between Ragged Island and Long Island for organizing the fairs, which were a regular social activity between the two islands. And my parents were usually involved in those fairs and organizing the people in Ragged Island. My mother was proud of her craft-making skills, and she delighted in sewing and crocheting beautiful exhibits for the fairs. Mama very quickly involved herself in the women's branch of the Progressive Liberal Party during the early 50s. At this time, she was the secretary and treasurer of the women's branch of the PLP. At the time, although the population was made up of majority of Black people, because of the existence of the practice at the time of men with more than one vote, one piece of property, being able to cast a vote for each piece of property, these persons were aligned with the ruling elite. It was not the UBP at the time. It was the ruling elite controlling the power forces in the country. This created a great disadvantage for the Progressive Liberal Party and was a deterrent to victory for the PLP. At this time also, Bahamian women could not vote at all. Women in Britain, in the United States, and the major Caribbean islands, such as Jamaica, Trinidad, and Barbados, could vote. And if you go on your computer, which I've done a couple times, you will see that the struggles in Great Britain were not easy. One suffragette was actually knocked down by another person who was angry with them for advocating this enfranchisement for them, knocked her down with a horse and trampled on her. In the course of getting justice, we have to take on major, major challenges. It was also quite natural in 1960 when the Progressive Liberal Party made the decision to champion the cause for the women to vote, that my mother readily joined the women and became involved in the formation of the women's suffrage movement. And she was also the secretary of that movement. You know the ladies who came forward to lead the movement. They were members of trade unions. Some were members of the PLP, others were members of the Mothers Club. Some were persons who supported the ruling elite of the day. In a short time, they gained the support of thousands of other women. Mrs. Mary Ingram was the first leader of the group. I say to you today, my sisters, that Bahamian women must never let the memory of these brave women of the suffragette movement go to the dust. For it was not an easy task to take on the ruling elite and to organize themselves and demand the right to vote equally with men. Believe it or not, some men did not want the women to organize because there was still the backward notion, as we know, that a woman's place is in the home and that's where she should stay. But these noble women were not to be deterred by backwardness and ignorance. They forged on, determined that they would be victorious in their cause. Bahamian women were employed in the homes of the ruling elite, the Bay Street Boys, as they were called, as maids and housekeepers. Many women also worked in hotels, and they were joining the unions, which were also being led by the PLP leaders. Oppression knows no gender. As men were oppressed, so were women. The leaders of the Progressive Liberal Party, some of whom were union leaders, strongly agitated against the oppressive conditions facing the workers and began the fight for majority rule. Between 1951 and 1952, the women decided that they would have to take their demands to the House of Assembly and began to attend meetings of the House. That was their commitment. They made the time to do the work which they considered had to be done. They got the support of Dr. Raymond Walker and Mr. A.F. Adderley, who presented petitions to the House of Assembly and the Legislative Council. The suffragists aligned themselves with the newly formed Progressive Liberal Party, which was challenging the power of the Bay Street Boys over the economy and the political life of the Bahamas. The Progressive Liberal Party advocated for universal adult suffrage, which would do away with the property vote and obviously give the women the right to vote as well. Hence, the struggle for the right to vote for women became inextricably linked to that party's struggle for majority rule. This is history. We cannot piece it up. We cannot push it aside. This is history. And our history makes us want to go to the future. Women members of the trade union movement at that time, who were also members of the Federation of Labor led by Sir Randall Fox, were able to solicit the support of the Federation of Labor, and Sir Randall worked diligently with the suffragettes, assisting them with preparation of petitions and other documents. Around this time, also 1958 to 1959, Sir Gerald Cash, supported by Sir Milo Butler, presented another petition to the House of Assembly on behalf of the suffragettes. I was a young woman at the time, a student in shorthand and typing with Lady Zoe Maynard, and I was called upon on many occasions to assist with typing those petitions and other documents for the movement. It was a very exciting time. I enjoyed being with those women, young people. There's a different spirit engendered in you when you are fighting for justice for all. You're not fighting for a Mercedes-Benz at the moment. You're not looking for the big house, the mansion, and stressing yourself out. We need to fight for social justice for all. In 1959, Dr. Doris Johnson, who had been working with the suffragettes during her holidays from university, returned home and joined the suffragette movement. At this time also, the Bahamas was still a British colony, and the women of the suffragette movement decided that it was time to make the bold move and petition the colonial secretary in England to present their petition, their plea for the enfranchisement. Also in 1959, Dr. Doris Johnson addressed the House of Assembly demanding, among other things, the inclusion of women on jurors and as members of boards and committees of government, an end to sending delinquent girls between the ages of 8 and 11 to prison, for females to be licensed as justices of the peace, as well as to petition the House of Assembly for the vote for women. Following the address by Dr. Doris, the very next day, the suffragettes, led by Mrs. Mary Ingram, marched to Government House and demanded that the law be changed. And we know the course of events after that. Bahamian women voted for the first time in 1962. I want to end here. I think I've gotten some of what I basically wanted to say anyway. Students of the College of the Bahamas, I challenge you today. You are most important to this process. We need systemic change. We need a change that will include all of us in this power structure, not only at election time. Perhaps it's time to examine the Westminster system, which was handed down by the British. Perhaps it's not for us. And we have not examined it. Perhaps we need to examine it. You are in academia. You are in the right place, students, to carry out the studies, the investigations of other processes, to analyze and criticize. I wish you every success in your quest to find your place on the way forward. The fight is not yet done.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Edward Andrew, alias Dud Maynard. I am very happy to have been invited to speak here this morning because I see the need for our children to understand what happened in years gone by and what has been done to enable them to have the amount of facilities and the amount of teachers and plant to prepare them to take over this country. And it feels to me as if we have taken over our country politically, but our children are falling behind, and that is a grievous feeling to me. It makes me feel like I made sacrifices in vain. Some of us risk our lives. We risk all so that you could have. And I'm sorry, but it's emotional for me. Because when I was making £3 a week, my mother gave 10 shillings of that to the organization. And I'm not upset about that. I just feel that lying down in Bay Street Black Tuesday hasn't come home to you people. And the reason why tears are coming from my eyes is because I sat in the cafeteria over there while my men were working on it and saw young ladies passing marijuana cigarette around to one another under the boys. 3 young ladies, beautiful girls, and young men who, if they would only buckle down, have a chance to be something in this country. And they're destroying their lungs and their brains. So, you know, you must realize that, as Mrs. Bostwick said, our farm mothers made sacrifices. And they made sacrifices with you in mind, even before you were conceived. And I'm speaking to the young people in this country. You have to make an effort to make something of yourselves. Be one of the leaders in this country. You don't have to be prime minister to be leader. You don't have to be a member of parliament to be leader. Lead in your own business or in whatever you do. It's not good enough for some to go away to college and study medicine and become a doctor or a lawyer. You must think of this country and future generations the way we did. I got into it at age 14. And I'm still emotional about it. I still feel sometimes like I wasted my time. You know, the women's suffrage movement really began fighting in earnest probably in 1953. Because in 1954, as was said earlier, they called on the Governor General. And for those of you who want to do research, look at the Nassau Guardian of January 22nd, 1954, and you will see the story. And the fight at that time seemed useless because no one was listening. And the fellow who seemed to command, and sometimes I feel frightened people around him, Stafford Sands, said it would never happen, not even over his dead body. And when it happened, and then he lost the election in 1967, mind, he won. But he resigned. He said he would not take his seat in the House of Assembly, and he left his country. That's how strong he felt about it. And that's why I become angry with people when they say they don't want Stafford Sands' picture on the $10. You need to have his picture there. And we need to let the children know that's the nigger who treat us like that. And when I say nigger, I ain't talking about no color of skin. I'm talking about bad ways. The leading women in the movement was Mabel Walker, Mary Ingram, my mother, Georgiana Simmons, and these were all strong women, you know. I know my mother was like the general. When she tell you, come to attention, you came to attention. And when she tell you, march, you march. And Mrs. Lockhart was the same way. Wallace just told you about that. Mrs. Isaacs, Dame Alberta Isaacs, she did her part by selling coconut cakes and benny cakes and candy. She was very good at making confectionery stuff. And put the money to buy the paper, to print what we needed to print and so on. And you know, some of the women who became involved were like Beryl Hannah, Marge Brown, Grace Wilson, Willa Mae Sanders. I used to call her Technicolor Head. Every time you see her, her hair is a different color. But she was she was in that business. Ethel Camp. You hear about Audley Camp and Sons? Well, their mother was the strength behind that business. And she joined hands with these women. And she also helped to finance things and to get things done. Gladys Bailey, Mildred Moxie from Hay Street. Now, I want you to know that these, what I'm calling are for all strong women, strong-willed women. Then there was Una Hasty. Una Hasty, for the benefit of young people, is the grandmother of Ori J. Sands, who owns the insurance agency today. That is where they got their stamina from. People like that. Her sister, Veronica Lotmore. Ivy Mackey. Now, Ivy Mackey, by the way, was the first woman to vote in 1962. Now, Ms. Cooper, was the first woman to register, but she didn't vote at all in 62. Okay, I just want you to understand. So let's give credit to the people who were there and put the X. Now, Doris Johnson came back from school and on one trip, and the women, I was at the meeting, I was sitting off within hearing distance. I was a gap seed catcher. Because Mama didn't leave me, she carried me everywhere she went. Right next to where we lived on Wolf Road, there were a group of women who used to dance in the floor show and were very vulgar, and I used to like to hang out across to their house. So Mama said, bring your backside with me so you could learn something instead of foolishness. So I had to go everywhere she went. They recruited Dame Johnson because they felt that as an educated woman, she could speak for them. And that is how they got her actively involved. And even when she went back to school to do her PhD, they were still in contact with her and so on. A large number of women joined the movement, and the movement grew with women and men. And some of the men are, my deceased brother Clement Maynard, he couldn't help it. Mama telling me, you getting involved, and that's that. Even if he didn't want to, he had to get involved. But the interesting thing, there was a man from Australia by the name of John Purkis who was married to a Bahamian woman. And Mr. Purkis arranged to get films with the women's suffrage movement in England and other countries so that we would motivate our women more strongly. And he was a logistics man, and I assisted him with setting up for the films and so on. And he was always pushing, what are we going to do next? What are we going to do next? Charles Rodriguez from Farm Road. He was one of the financiers. Charles Rodriguez also loaned my mother and them the money to pay for Doris Johnson's schooling when she went back to do her PhD. Edgar Bain was also a financier. Right? Edgar Bain would supply all the flour. When you have a cookout, he supply all the rice because he was in the grocery business. Lyndon Pinlan was a legal advisor. Edmund Moxie, we had one old broke down PA system. So we had to always go back to him after a meeting to get it tweaked again. And I was there, I was known as the setup man in the logistics. They used to make me climb the tree and take chances with my wife going out on, with my life, going out on a small limb to put up speakers. A.D. Hanna was also a legal advisor. And I want you to know that the women of the women's suffrage movement were determined to win. And when they won in 1961, then they had to go ahead now and train the women. But you see, the men of the PLP didn't see the need to teach the women to vote. Say the women in Challenger, they can vote. One woman in Fox Hill was known in an election to say, I can vote for Mr. Johnstone because he's a good-looking white man. Now, I want you to know I'm not a racist, but I'm telling you the kind of mentality that we had to deal with. So all of the women of the suffrage movement got together. And I want you to know now, you had suffragettes from the PLP, from the UBP, from the independent side. We had independent people in the thing. But the most important thing is they got together like a hand and a glove, and they worked together. So I would like to see you young people, for heaven's sakes, do the best you can and be the best you can, because a lot of us made sacrifices for you. And please, remember, we did it out of love for generations that we didn't see yet. And all of us here at this table were not people who worked because we wanted to necessarily. We worked because we were told to, and then we got to love it so much we couldn't stop. I just stopped the other day because I don't intend to work for this thing in my 70s. But I'm getting the feeling that I got to start again, because when I see our children not taking advantage of the opportunities available to them, it hurts me. And it's hurting you. Don't throw away your life. Don't play with your future. Get down to business. I see people, you coming to this college, people who come into this college free. I went to St. Augustine's for one term, and Mama couldn't afford to pay for me to go to St. Augustine's. She said, Dad, the mortgage is I can't afford to pay for you to go to, and I understood that. Mama couldn't afford to pay, and Mama had a plan. Okay? People would see you things and they don't understand what you did to have it. And I'm mad with the politicians who, and look here, the people who understand the least is the DNA. I let you know that right now. Don't get fooled. Okay? Ain't none of them know how nothing go. None of them was ever involved in nothing. I want you today to make up your minds that you're going to be somebody in this country. You're going to rise to whatever height God allow you to go to. Because people made sacrifices, people did without, people took chances with their lives. I was shot at trying to make things better for you all before you were born. And I'm not asking you to feel indebted to me for it. You should be indebted to yourself to do the best you can. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Moderator, that Mr. Maynard is a hard act to follow. But let me say that Doris brought militancy to the suffrage movement. I remember her saying to the women that you have to move now. But they were saying that they were not able to do it, but they would like her to do it. So she took on the position. Thank you now. On behalf of my sister, Mrs. Barbara Brooks, my two brothers, Henry and Oswald Sands, Doris' son, Gerald, and her 3 grandchildren, and 2 great-grands, we wish to thank the Bureau of Women's Affairs and the College of the Bahamas for the recognition being given to us, to our sister, and the other women who led the way, and all of the women and men who were involved in the suffrage movement. We appreciate your efforts to bring this very important event in our Bahamian history to the forefront. This reflection is a combined effort between my sister Barbara and me. Dame Doris was born on June 19th, 1921. She was one of 9 children born to John Albert Sands of Sandy Point, Abaco, and Sarah Elizabeth Sands from Driggs Hill, Andros. Doris was a very religious and Christian woman who took part in her church at Bethel Baptist on Meeting Street. My sister Barbara remembers that as a child, Doris would try to read anything that was written on paper. And as an adult, Doris was very articulate and well-dressed. Doris was a teacher at the then Western Senior School, now C.R. Walker Senior High. She was also a headmistress at Sandilands Primary School in Fox Hill. Doris joined the women's suffrage movement in September of 1958. When she returned home from her studies at the University of Toronto, in 1959, she led a march to the House of Assembly demanding that women be given the right to vote. Her petition was given in the Magistrate Court of Maxwell Thompson as the UBP members of Parliament refused to have her address them in the House of Assembly. Doris was also a member of the group that traveled to London to petition for the rights of women to vote. After many petitions, on February 1961, the House of Assembly passed the bill giving women the right to vote. This was not to come into effect until June 30th, 1962. Women over 21 years voted for the first time on November 26, 1962. Dame Doris was the first woman to contest a seat in the general elections. And she ran on the PLP ticket for Eleuthera in 1962, but did not win the seat. Dame Doris was responsible for the formation of the National Women's Movement, which formed the first cooperative in the Bahamas. She was the head of the Department of Social Studies at Southern University in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, from 1965 to 1967, and a lecturer at Florida Memorial College from 1967 to 1969. In 1967, she was the first woman appointed to the Senate. Between 1968 and 1969, Dame Doris was made a cabinet minister without portfolio and also government leader in the Senate under the PLP government. In 1979, Dr. Johnson was knighted by Queen Elizabeth and made Dame Commander of the Most Excellent Order. Doris was also a very proud Delta Sigma Theta. Doris is also known for her book, The Quiet Revolution, in the Bahamas, which chronicles the struggle of the Black majority in the Bahamas to achieve political power by peaceful democratic process. Dame Doris Johnson died on June 21st, 1983. She was 62 years old. In 2000, Mr. Franklin Wilson, president of Arawak Homes, named a subdivision in her honor, which is located in the Southern District of New Providence. In October 2002, a senior high school was built and named in her honor. It was officially opened in May 2011. For me, I remember Lady Marguerite Pindling fighting shoulder to shoulder with Doris. I remember carrying a placard which read, "No nation is greater than its womanhood," on Bay Street. I also remember going on marches with my sister and attending meetings with her, especially the march from Windsor Park to Southern Recreation Ground on Market Street. I also remember going with her to Dr. Walker's building on Blue Hill Road and Mary Ingram's home, where the discussion was always about getting the votes for women. Bless you.
I want you to understand something. When I was chairman of the PLP, apart from doing other things, I had research done on the things that I couldn't remember and had it put in booklet form. I gave a box with 5,000 copies of it to the Ministry of Education. Okay? Mr. Coakley was Minister of Education at that time. And a reverend who was a first assistant secretary or something at Education gave, in giving his charge to the Baptist community on that Sunday, said these words, and I'll never forget them. They're trying to brainwash the children. Okay? And I heard the same man say since then, we don't have any history. How you can have history when you all throw away the books?
I want to add just something to what Mr. Maynard said, what Dud said. When my mother packed her bags to go to England with Dr. Doris and H.M. Taylor, she left behind 3 children under the age of 16. She brought all of us to Nassau, as I said in my talk, but when she went to England, she still had 3 children who needed care. My father supported my mother fully, young men. He never kept her back. And unless we get to that point today to know that that is what we need, we ain't going forward nowhere. That's the whole deal.
Thank you.
I guess I'm the oldest one here at this table. I might not look that way.
That ain't true. Women don't get old.
But what I'm saying, Black people had a very difficult time in the Bahamas. And many of us, when we speak of what happened to Black people at that time, we say, oh, we are a racist. But that's not so. We had a difficult time. Women were mostly. Some of them were housewives. Someone worked in the market. Most of them worked in domestic. Those who worked in the public service were either teachers or nurses. But we never moved. Even with the Black men, they didn't have much. Now remember, New Providence wasn't like New Providence is now. New Providence almost ended at Wolf Road. We didn't have an Angliston, and we had Fox Hill. Angliston was a new area, which started in the 1960s. So a lot of things happened that black people didn't even have an opportunity to do things in this country. Remember too, for many years we only had 6 black men in the House of Assembly. 6. Even after 56, when the PLP came in, they only had 6. So there was a lot of work to do in terms of education. Education, my parents, Dr. Claudius Roland Walker, when he came home as the first Bahamian physician and surgeon to return home, said education was the key. Education was the key for us to move, for the black people to move from just being what we were to move up the ladder. And through education, he always said, we could get political and economic power. And women, during the time of the project, most of the women stayed home in the Bahamas while their men went on the project. So women took care of their families. They took care of their families. So only through that right of being able to be the breadwinner, along with the funds their husbands sent home, they did everything. But they couldn't vote. They couldn't get good jobs. They couldn't do any of those things. And sometimes I feel, now this is something really gets, we don't know what happened in the past. And we need to know what happened in the past so we can understand what is happening now. Because most of you young people think it was always like this. It was not always like this. There was a time, I am from over the hill. I am from Hospital Lane. I was born in Hospital Lane. My father and mother had 6 children. My mother was an American, as I've stated. They met at Harvard University. But what I'm saying, they fought because they believe in the rights of human beings to make something of themselves. We can all be better off if we studied. And I agree with Dud Maynard because he said we waste so much time. Sometimes when I pass here, I see all these college students over there playing domino, sitting around. You don't have time to waste. This country needs every one of you if we're going to move forward.
I think, Ms. Banville, that the country, the system in the country today is not organized in a way for some of us to be able to readily have access to benefiting from everything that is, something has to be done here. Not all people are aggressive. Not all of us will go to the politicians to look for our scholarships, for what we do. I find it very puzzling. I find it very puzzling that we have such an increase in crime and such poverty still in areas like Baintown, Grantstown, Engliston, Kemp Road. There are dumps. And when I pass there, I wonder, what do these leaders think about these people? Why aren't we changing the process which will bring them into a cleaner lifestyle? Why aren't we educating these people out of this? In other countries, people go into the communities and they teach the people. We don't seem to have any legs to go forward. And I really wonder when this is going to dawn on us that it's all of us. The man in the mirror is you. We have to do it. We can't look to our leaders to tell us everything. We have to make demands on them to make our country livable, habitable, clean, decent, and crime-free. We have to make these demands. The PLP doesn't have a monopoly on it. The FNM doesn't have a monopoly on it. The DNA doesn't have the monopoly on it. We have to get involved.
Thank you very much. We are short on time.
Excuse me, but I would just like to make it, because, you know, people always refer to Over the Hill as a dump, ghetto, and all those things. And I like to make something straight. I live over there. I live there. And I've been there living there a long time. My father built his house there and he did his investment, everything right there. And I wish people get out this notion about what Over the Hill is all about. If it weren't for Over the Hill, you wouldn't have the black people would have made successful in this country today. And I want you to believe that. See, it annoys me. Everything is a dump, everything is a ghetto. But there are some good things coming from Over the Hill. I am just saying it because I read and I hear about it. We didn't even know about ghetto. That's not even a Bahamian word, ghetto. And it just annoys me. Because when you think about any black person who has been successful in this country have come right from Over the Hill. And I want you all to believe that.
I have given the woman's deaths information to pass on to the schools. I think we need to make a serious effort to educate the children about their past and where their parents came from and where they're expected to go. That's number one. Number two, I don't want to leave here without saying something else to you all. Remember this, all poor people aren't black. And all black people ain't poor. Okay? You need to understand that. Forget about color. It's time in this country for us to interact with one another, all Bahamians.
That's right, together.
All right? And when people come to me and say, but look like you friendly with the white people. I say, the white people is my people. Now, if they're your people, that's your business. But we need to love one another and feel sorry for those who ain't got enough sense to love one another. In one word, the answer is education.
Thank you.